Classical music has slipped into almost complete irrelevance in our society. It was already pretty irrelevant 40 years ago, back when popular music was still relevant in society. And now that popular music itself is not really relevant, classical music appears to be just this absurd anachronism. And I can tell you, anytime that I've attended classical music performances in New York City, the age of the audience is like 75 years old, the average age. And any young person that's there, I get the impression that they are just there because they're students at a conservatory and they're there for their education. And if you think about our society, you almost never hear classical music like in a public setting. It just doesn't happen. And in fact, the only real counterexample I can think of from 30 years of living in New York City was that there used to be this gym in Soho, East Soho. It was called the Printing House. And at the Printing House, they used to actually pipe in classical music into the workout area. So while you did your exercise, you could listen to classical music, right? You didn't have to listen to zom, 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 that music. You don't actually have to exercise to that music. Classical music is brilliant to exercise to, but that's like one example in 30 years. Classical music just isn't around. It's just not relevant. And I think a big part of the reason for this has to do with the American educational system, which a long time ago decided that, education in music and education in the arts, it just wasn't relevant because, the reasoning went, that type of education just doesn't prepare you to be a good little docile neo-feudal wage slave. But in light of that, I would pose the question, where does that leave us now? Now that the ruling class doesn't need us as wage slaves anymore? Now that we are just well on our way to being so many useless eaters, if you will? Like where does this hole in our education leave us? I would argue that it leaves us in a much weaker spot to face the challenges that we face ahead. And those challenges are basically, how on earth do we retain the dignity of the human species? And the measure of which has always been the arts. Now, as far as my own history with classical music, I didn't have a really great formal training in music education as a child. And in my childhood home, there was like scattered classical music present. There was some Beethoven, there was some Scott Joplin, Rags. I had a copy of Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf, which I never really cared for. And also I would say that there was kind of just enough classical music lying around my childhood home that I could be exposed to it and, develop at least the beginnings of a taste for instrumental music. I mean, as a younger child, I pretty much was more interested in classical music than I was in popular music. Now, later in my life, like after college, I went through a phase where classical music was pretty much all I listened to. And I became a much more, a deeper listener to classical music. But my tastes were pretty narrow. I was mainly interested in Mozart, Haydn, some Chopin, some Beethoven. I did listen to a bit of Baroque music, but honestly, it was mainly just the main concertos of Bach and Handel. Honestly, I was pretty much a normie when it came to Baroque music, at the time. And then still later in my life, I got very deeply into Renaissance choral music, particularly settings of the Christian Mass, which is a subset of classical music that I still find very fascinating and is very much a part of my life. However, in the last 10 years, classical music sort of entered my life yet again in a new form. And it came in the form of Glenn Gould's recordings of the works for solo keyboard by Johann Sebastian Bach. And this happened as something of an accident, actually. I had heard a random piece of advice that if one listened to classical music for, an hour or two early in the morning or right before going to bed, if one did this, it really helped you kind of deal with the mental trauma of our society, deal with the emotions and the stress of having to be subjected to the chaos and insanity and violence that this society serves up to each and every one of us every day. And the person giving this advice had mentioned that it was very important that it be early classical music, and they kind of implied that Bach worked the best, but they made the distinction that it needed to be music that was not really aimed at exciting one's emotions, and in particular, calling out the Romantic era of classical music, right? It was more Bach and Mozart, and and like so many of us who are struggling to survive in this society, I decided to give it a try, and at the time, I was sort of curious about Glenn Gould. I had never actually listened to any Glenn Gould, but I knew he was, a super famous pianist. And so I kind of put the two things together, on a lark. And I just decided to try it by downloading Glenn Gould's recordings of Bach's English and French suites, the complete edition of the English and French suites. And I gave this little practice a try just in the morning. But I would listen for, at least an hour, sometimes two. And I can tell you that this person's observations about doing this were something of an understatement. I would say that not only does it help you regulate your emotions in the midst of chaos and insane social conditions, not only does it do that, but I would say that it actually, in some strange way, it heals the human brain. It's almost a little bit like the effects of meditation over time. It's not that you will just listen once and you feel better, but as you expose yourself to this music first thing in the morning, it kind of changes your outlook. Your outlook on life and kind of your outlook on what you observe in the society. And the reason that I think that it does this, at least in the case of Bach, is that Bach is pretty famous for having imbued his music with a kind of mathematical structure to it. And I think when you listen in this long form format, right, you don't just dial up your favorite piece of Bach and be like, oh, that's so great, and then you get on with your day. No, you actually, have Bach playing in the morning over a long stretch of time, during which time I find that you can do in any number of activities. I feel that it actually sort of challenges your brain. It throws down a challenge for your brain to almost subconsciously grapple with the mathematical complexity of the music that you're hearing, right? Without consciously and directly dealing with the music, your brain is actually just invited to kind of drink in the mathematical splendor of the music, if you will. And like I said, I find that you can do lots of quiet activities while you do this. I usually write for this YouTube channel, but you can do many things. You can walk, you can exercise, you can kind of read. You can't really doom scroll social media. That's not going to work. for obvious reasons, right? If you have a broken leg, you can't jump up and down on it and expect it to heal. So, doom scrolling is kind of out, but there's a whole spectrum of, quiet activities that you can do while listening. And this actually brings us to our next selection in the 10 albums for Desert Island Exile, which perhaps not surprisingly is going to be Glenn Gould's interpretations of Bach's English and French suites. But I should say that in terms of this more general practice that we're talking about, of long-form listening in the morning, I find that Gould's interpretations of many of Bach's works for solo keyboard work absolutely beautifully. Certainly his complete partitas works beautifully, complete toccatas, the Goldberg variations, or at least his first recording of the Goldberg variations. Don't really care for the second recording. His recordings of the Well-Tempered Clavier, the preludes, fugues, and fugettas. And any of these recordings works beautifully. But for me, I would say my absolute favorite are the English and French suites. And I think it's just kind of a personal preference. The suites, they kind of hit this magical spot in terms of the variation of tone and key and tempo and just our artistic interest. I find the partitas and the toccatas to be like a kind of a more specific and narrowly defined listening experience compared to the suites. And so if I had to bring something with me to the desert island, it would be the complete French and English suites. Now, what I really want to talk about in this video is why Glenn Gould. Okay, and when we ask why Glenn Gould, we are in the realm of interpretation of classical music. And I find that, for most people that are just casual listeners to classical music, they're really not overly concerned with interpretation. In fact, a lot of times, a casual listener will really not even be aware of who is performing the music in a lot of instances. If a casual listener knows who's performing it, there's probably a pretty good chance that it's like some superstar that is such a huge star they actually transcend the world of music almost, like Luciano Pavarotti or, maybe Yo-Yo Ma or Renee Fleming, or like some gigantic star that just everybody recognizes the name, whether or not they even listen to any classical music at all. But, interpretation, when you get a little bit more deeply into listening to classical music, it's a pretty big deal, especially the interpretation of works by Bach. And this has to do with the fact, that these works, unlike music of the modern era, these works were, defined in written form for hundreds of years. And in that written form, there really wasn't that specific an indication of how these works were supposed to be performed. So this is why you get all of this latitude in terms of how people perform these works. Now, Glenn Gould himself, he is known as a very idiosyncratic interpreter of Bach. And it's kind of one of those things where you either love him or you hate him, right? If you're even concerned with him at all. He evokes a very strong reaction. And the people that dislike Glenn Gould find that he is, kind of an egocentric interpreter that's like projecting a lot of his own ideas into the work. And people that love him say the exact opposite, that there's something about Gould that brings out like the purity of Bach's music. And I find myself firmly in the second camp. I adore Glenn Gould's interpretations. And if I was going to talk about what I like so much about his interpretations, I think my approach to the interpretation of classical music is as follows. I think people should just take the most direct approach imaginable, which is to simply listen carefully to like different versions, different interpretations of works, and just make up your own mind about them. You don't have to be a music expert to do this. All you really have to do is actually care what the difference is between what you're listening to. And this is how I came to my love of Glenn Gould's interpretations. And I'll tell you succinctly what, to me, to my ear, defines the magic of Glenn Gould's interpretations. So the first aspect of his interpretation has to do with dynamics and tempo. And I would say that Glenn Gould studiously avoids variations in dynamics and tempo that call attention to a specific moment in the music or even a specific part of the music at the expense of the whole, at the expense of the appreciation of the entire piece of music. And I find that this varies a great deal from what most pianists actually do, particularly when they interpret Bach. They almost prioritize the manipulation of dynamics and tempo, you know, to call attention to whatever moment in the music that they feel is a crescendo or is a moment that should be paid attention to. They will vary these musics, and in listening to these works, you know, performed by pianists other than Gould, you simply, your attention is drawn constantly to individual moments, individual pieces of the music. And you never hear this with Glenn Gould, and it's probably my favorite thing about Glenn Gould. The second aspect of Glenn Gould's interpretations has to do with the attack that he achieves on the keyboard. Gould has a what I would describe as a very kind of elegant and dry sort of articulation of the notes in Bach, which comes from the fact that he really doesn't use a lot of pedal, and he also has a tendency to use like staccato articulation more than other pianists. And so these two things together wind up giving they give his attack on the notes sort of the flavor a little bit of the attack of a harpsichord, and also a little bit of the attack of like a small Renaissance pipe organ, just to my ear. And for the Renaissance pipe organ, you can really hear this in the preludes, fugues, and fughettas. But you hear it all over. You hear it in certain parts of the Well-Tempered Clavier. It's really kind of a lovely articulation, particularly for the works of Bach. Now, the third element of his interpretation has to do with the balance of the left and the right hand. And, you know, in Gould, he obviously takes great pains to keep the articulation of the left and right hand very, very even and very equally audible. And as opposed to what happens with most pianists playing Bach, is you'll find that the left hand gets kind of murky, and it just gets submerged against the dominant line of the right hand. Gould does not do this, and I think it's really important in the appreciation of these complex and beautiful mathematical works of Bach. Part of it is hearing the interplay between the left and the right hand, and the fact that it is done so evenly, and both are kept so clearly audible, that it's a wonderful aspect of his interpretation. So these three elements of interpretation just make Glenn Gould completely magical for me. In fact, I have to say, he kind of awakened pianistic works of classical music for me across the board. I mean, I did listen to them in the past. I remember being a fan of Dino Lupati and Solomon and other pianists, but I mean, Glenn Gould kind of awakened something on a whole other level. Now, just to breathe some life into, my impressions of his interpretation, I'm going to throw out an example that, if you want, you could actually go listen to and kind of see what I'm talking about and see if you agree with me or not. And this is just an example of actually doing one of these comparisons with Glenn Gould against another pianist's interpretations. And for this, I've picked Argentinian pianist Martha Argerich. If you take Martha Argerich, her recording of English Suite No. 2, and you compare that to Glenn Gould, and we'll just compare the Gigue, just the final movement. If you listen to both of those and compare them, this is what I hear when I listen to Martha Argerich play. When I listen to her performance of the Gigue, it just sounds so labored to me. It's so labored, it's so heavy. It's almost like it's tripping over itself a little bit. It's the image that I get is like someone performing a ballet in mud. That's the image. And you also have like weird variations and dynamics between the left and right hand, where like the left hand all of a sudden is loud and then the right hand is loud. Doesn't actually sound that good to my ear. And so if you compare this Gigue with Glenn Gould's interpretation of the Gigue, which, my heavens, when you listen to his performance, it's an unbelievably beautiful whole. There's almost nothing in his performance of that movement of English Suite 2 that would detract from appreciating the entire Gigue as almost like a single moment in time. It is absolutely remarkable. Like you're just breathless and swept up in his interpretation of it. I think the reason is, again, is that there is just nothing that's pulling your attention away from the whole. We'll do one other comparison with Martha Argerich. Let's take the saraband. Martha Argerich's interpretation of the saraband, I mean, honestly, she takes it at a glacial pace. Like, it is so slow, it is just almost boring. And in comparison to Gould, and actually this brings up another aspect of Glenn Gould's interpretation that I'll mention now, is that, his detractors will often call out that they feel that Glenn Gould just plays too fast, kind of in general. But when I listen to Glenn Gould, I don't hear this at all. What I hear with tempo in Glenn Gould is I am amazed at how well he judges the tempos of movements across an entire work, whether it's a suite, whether it's a partita, whatever. It's remarkable to me how well the choice of tempo from the different movements just kind of meshes in a way that, again, does not distract you from the whole appreciation of the suite. And so yes, sometimes Gould can play blindingly fast, and sometimes, it'll be so fast that I'll wonder, I wonder what that movement would sound like if it was a little bit slower. But if I step back and look in the context of, the entire piece, whatever it is, the really fast playing will make sense compared to the choices in the other movements. Now, in contrast with Argerich, I find it extremely distracting that the saraband is suddenly glacial compared to all the other movements. Like it doesn't really make sense to me aesthetically. Now, and you can do this comparison with any other pianist, and it's very instructive. I'll just do one more comparison of the same movement of English Suite Number 2. Let's take Andras Schiff. Now, when I listen to the Gigue as performed by Andras Schiff, what I hear is you'll hear that he inserts these weird, like micro pauses, if you want to call it that. These little pauses or hitches, like right before the articulation of certain notes. And to my ear, it just absolutely sounds terrible. Like it literally just ruins the Gigue. Just this one practice. I mean, it almost sounds like buffering, like you're on the internet and your internet connection is slow. And it's almost like that. It is so distracting. So this is how I like to approach interpretation. And I'll just say that, of course, I'm not criticizing Martha Argeric's playing. Martha Argerich, or Andras Schiff for that matter, these are world-class virtuoso pianists, right? What I'm saying is that I don't like their interpretations. Okay, lay people can't really criticize virtuoso playing, but the interpretation of works, particularly of someone like Johann Sebastian Bach, interpretation is the realm of the listener, right? The listener has every right to say, yes, this virtuoso playing is being directed in a way that is not producing a coherent musical whole to my ear compared to other ways to interpret it. That is completely valid. And for me, it's actually one of the main joys of listening to classical music is hearing the difference in interpretation and deciding what is one's own personal standard for the approach to interpretation of various works. So I'm just going to say a few more words about Glenn Gould as an interpreter. Okay, the first is that it has to do with the way I kind of got into listening to Glenn Gould, which is again doing this long form listening in the morning. And when one does this, I find it's really helpful to have like a consistent approach to interpretation across listening to a whole collection of works, like the complete partitas, the complete suites, and what have you. And you do have a somewhat limited number of artists to pick from, for the simple reason that most artists don't just spend their whole life recording the works of Bach, and there's a very good reason, right? If you're a young pianist in conservatory, right? That's not going to be your plan to become a hermit and record Bach. That's career suicide. What you want to do is get a selection of pieces, that cover a lot of territory, so that you can get gigs, so that you can get concert engagements, and in that, you will have your favorite Bach piece that you will learn to play, and usually it'll be used as a warm-up for the quote-unquote heavier, more serious works that come later on in the performance, and that's how you'll approach it. So I think it's worth mentioning that we're incredibly lucky that Glenn Gould was so genius in his interpretation of Bach, but he was also like really obsessed with creating a comprehensive recorded summary of Bach's keyboard works, the likes of which is pretty rare. Like there's a few others that have done fairly well in terms of comprehensiveness. Andras Schiff is one, Murray Pariah is another. But you know, most like famous pianists, you know, they really will not have recorded very many of these works. I mean, more people have recorded the Well-Tempered Clavier in its entirety, but in terms of partitas or suites, or you know, they will pick a favorite or two, and that will be what they perform in concert, and that will be what they record. So we're very lucky that Glenn Gould was so obsessed with Bach. Now, the second thing to mention about Glenn Gould is that he, you know, a lot of his recordings are older, you know, from when he was young, which means that you do have to grapple a bit with sound quality of older recordings. What I can say there is that I really don't find them to be that bad. I've certainly heard much worse in terms of older recordings of pianistic music. So I don't really find that is much of a barrier. And the last thing to mention about Gould, and I couldn't possibly do a video on Glenn Gould without bringing up his infamous humming, is you know, how people feel about the fact that Glenn Gould used to hum along with his playing. He was quite famous for this. For his detractors, this is just an abomination that he does this. He's usually humming like the dominant line of the right hand, not always, but usually. And what can I say? In my opinion, Glenn Gould is so incredibly brilliant that I could care less that he's humming. And honestly, I mean, over listening to him over the years, I've come to actually be quite fond of his humming. It usually doesn't last that long, and it's almost like just a little human like touchstone in the performance that you're like, oh yeah, there he is, and it kind of cues you in. We're listening to Glenn Gould. It's just a strange little thing, but I actually am kind of fond of it. So I'm definitely not in the camp of people that think it is an abomination. So there you have it. You know, for Desert Island Exile. And if you think about exile on a desert island, I think that mental health would be pretty challenging if you were exiled to a desert island. And so I think that in particular this way of appreciating classical music and the effect of classical music on the emotions, on the human brain, I would never head off to a desert island without my favorite piece from Glenn Gould and his interpretations of Bach, which would absolutely be the complete edition of the English and French suites. And you know, if you're somebody that for which classical music has always just been like a casual thing, like maybe you just have your favorite piece or maybe two and all, and you're curious about listening a bit deeper, I would encourage everybody to give this practice a try. I can say that it has actually changed my life fairly significantly. I absolutely love listening to Bach in the morning. I may not listen every morning, but I do on most mornings. And it actually pretty radically changes the tenor of each day. And so if you're curious about a way to kind of deepen not just your appreciation, but your awareness and the artistic benefit of classical music, I would actually give it a try. And I think that Glenn Gould's recordings of Johann Sebastian Bach are absolutely brilliant for this purpose. So once again, Bach's English and French suites and Glenn Gould is the third installment of our 10 discs for Desert Island Exile. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And do stay tuned if you're enjoying this series. Like and subscribe so you won't miss the next installment of 10 albums for Desert Island Exile. Thanks a lot, and we'll be seeing you.